The school was an ordinary place on the outside, with red bricks, tall windows, and a playground that filled with laughter during breaks. Inside, however, each classroom carried its own stories, struggles, and little dramas that shaped the lives of the students. Among all the rooms, the music class was one of the most unpredictable. Sometimes it was filled with joyful singing, spa, and sometimes with the nervous silence of students who feared being put on the spot. The piano stood in the corner, polished but rarely touched, like a silent witness to all that happened in that room. In this environment studied a girl named Maya. She was a quiet student, one of those children who rarely drew attention to herself. She always sat near the middle rows, never too close to the front where the teacher's sharp eyes could land on her, and never too far back where the rowdier kids laughed and joked. Maya kept her head down most of the time, her notebooks neat, her pencils sharpened, her bag always organized. She wasn't the kind of student who got into trouble, but she wasn't the kind who was easily noticed either. The teacher of this class was Mr. Harris, a tall man with thinning hair and a voice that carried across the room like a trumpet. He had a reputation for being strict, sometimes even harsh. He believed discipline was the only way to manage a class, and his idea of discipline often included embarrassing students if they failed to meet his expectations. He had a habit of picking on students who were shy, pushing them into situations where he expected them to fail. To him, it was a way to toughen them up. To the students, it was simply terrifying. Maya was one of his frequent targets, though not in a direct way. He didn't shout at her as much as he did at others, but he often gave her looks that suggested he doubted her abilities. Oh, she could feel it every time his gaze lingered on her, as if he was waiting for her to stumble, waiting for a moment when she could be exposed as weak or incapable. Maya was aware of this, and it made her retreat further into herself, careful not to give him any reason to call her out. What Mr. Harris didn't know, and what none of the students around her really noticed, was that Maya carried a secret gift. At home, away from the noisy chatter of school, she had spent countless hours sitting at her grandmother's old piano. The piano wasn't shiny or new like the one in the classroom. It had scratches on its wood, some of the keys were slightly faded, and it carried the smell of history. But to Maya, it was magical. Her grandmother had taught her how to place her fingers gently on the keys, how to let her emotions guide the melody, and how to turn pain, joy, or even silence into music. That piano was her comfort, her escape, and her closest friend in the classroom. Though no one knew this side of Maya, to her classmates, she was just the quiet girl who rarely raised her hand, who walked through the hallways without making noise, and who always seemed lost in thought. To Mr. Harris, she was another student who, in his eyes, lacked the confidence to stand out. He believed students like her needed to be pushed, even humiliated, to find their place. He never imagined that beneath her silence was a storm waiting to be unleashed. The classroom atmosphere itself added to this tension. The walls were lined with posters of famous musicians, from Beethoven to Louis Armstrong, but most of the students barely paid attention to them. The air often smelled of chalk and dust, and the old ceiling fan clicked every time it spun, creating a rhythm that was almost like a background beat. The piano sat in the corner, polished every week, but rarely played, as if it were waiting for someone worthy to touch it. Students whispered to each other whenever Mr. Harris walked past. Some respected him, others feared him, but all of them knew one thing: he picked you. There was no escape. You had to stand, speak, or perform, no matter how unprepared you were. Many had been reduced to tears under his sharp tongue, and many more prayed silently that his eyes wouldn't land on them. Maya often felt the weight of that piano every time she entered the room. She knew her secret talent, but she also knew the risk of revealing it. What if she made a mistake in front of everyone? What if her hands trembled or her mind went blank? The thought of being laughed at made her stay quiet, even though her heart sometimes longed to show the world what she could do. It was this fragile balance Maya's hidden gift. Mr. Harris's harsh methods and the silence of the classroom that set the stage for the unforgettable day to come. No one in that room, not even Maya herself, realized how quickly everything was about to change. The setting seemed ordinary, but in truth, it was the calm before a storm. The quiet before a melody that would shake every soul in that classroom. Mr. Harris had always been a man who believed in control. He ran his classroom the way a conductor runs an orchestra. Every note had to be sharp. Every student had to fall in line. And any mistake, no matter how small, was met with his disapproval. He had built his reputation on being strict. Some parents admired his no-nonsense approach, claiming he prepared students for the real world. But to the children who sat under his watchful eyes every day, he was a source of tension and unease. He enjoyed discipline, but more than that, he seemed to enjoy proving a point. When a student fumbled in front of their peers, he believed it taught them humility. When someone was too shy or timid, he believed embarrassment could spark courage. To him, this was his way of shaping young minds. But in reality, it often left scars, little invisible wounds that stayed with the children long after the class was over. On that particular day, the classroom felt heavy. The sun streamed through the dusty windows, but even its warmth couldn't soften the air of nervousness. The students were restless, whispering in low tones. Their laughter cut short whenever Mr. Harris's shoes clicked against the wooden floor. His presence filled the room like a shadow, impossible to ignore. As he walked up and down the aisles, his sharp eyes scanned each desk, each face, searching. It was a familiar routine. He liked to test his students, to see who would crumble and who would rise. Some of them sat rigid, silently praying he wouldn't choose them. Others tried to appear confident, hoping he might skip over them. But Mr. Harris had his own system. He didn't always pick the loudest or the weakest. Sometimes he targeted the quiet ones, the ones who thought they were invisible. To him, pulling them out of their shell often through humiliation was a form of entertainment disguised as teaching. That was when his gaze fell on Maya. She wasn't doing anything wrong. She never did. Her notebook was open, her pencil resting neatly on the margin, her back straight. She was listening, or at least pretending to, as he lectured about the importance of music and culture. But her quietness, her smallness, caught his attention like a whisper in the middle of a storm. He narrowed his eyes and felt the same thought. He had many times before. This girl needs to be broken out of her shell, in Mr. Harris's mind. Maya represented the kind of student who would never succeed in life unless she was pushed. He thought her silence was weakness. Her politeness was a lack of courage. And her invisibility was proof that she would never make it far. What he failed to see was that beneath her calm surface lived a well of strength and brilliance. But he wasn't looking for hidden potential. He was looking for a moment to prove his own authority. He glanced toward the piano in the corner, its black surface gleaming faintly under the classroom light. An idea began to form. The piano had always been his favorite tool for testing students. Most of them barely knew how to play, and when they failed, it provided him the opportunity to lecture about preparation, discipline, and practice. The thought of calling Maya up, the shyest of them all, sparked a certain satisfaction in him. He imagined her fumbling on the keys, her hands shaking, her classmates giggling. He imagined delivering a speech afterward about how fear must be conquered, about how failure was a lesson. To him, it would be the perfect demonstration. "Maya," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. The room fell silent. Dozens of heads turned in her direction, eyes wide with both sympathy and curiosity. Maya froze. She hadn't been expecting to be called. Her stomach tightened as she slowly looked up at the teacher. "Yes, sir." Her voice was barely above. A whisper, "Come here," he ordered, motioning toward the piano. A ripple of whispers traveled through the classroom. Everyone knew what was coming. Some of the students looked at her with pity, others with excitement. For them, it was a rare moment of drama in the monotony of school life. To be chosen by Mr. Harris was to become the center of attention, whether you liked it or not. Maya's feet felt heavy as she stood. Each step toward the piano echoed in her ears. She could feel her classmates' eyes following her, judging her, waiting for her to fail. Mr. Harris stood with his arms crossed, a slight smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "Play something," he said, almost casually, as if the request were simple. Maya's heart raced. She wanted to say she couldn't, to protest, to explain that she wasn't prepared. But the words stuck in her throat. The teacher's gaze was firm, unyielding. There was no escape. She slid onto the piano bench, her hands trembling as they hovered above the keys. Mr. Harris leaned against his desk, watching. In his mind, the lesson was already unfolding. He could almost hear the clumsy notes she would press, the awkward silence that would follow. He was ready to step in, to deliver his speech about courage and failure. The smirk on his face widened slightly, certain of the outcome. But what he didn't realize, what no one in that room yet understood, was that his attempt to mock Maya would soon backfire in a way that would leave him utterly speechless. Maya sat on the piano bench, her back straight, but her hands frozen just above the keys. The polished surface of the instrument reflected the anxious faces of her classmates, all staring at her as if she were about to step into an arena. Her chest rose and fell quickly, each breath shallow, as though the very air of the room had turned heavy. For a moment, she wished she could disappear, vanish into the crowd, slip back into her seat, and erase this moment altogether. But there was no escape. Mr. Harris's sharp eyes pinned her in place like a hawk watching its prey. He had chosen her, and once he made such a decision, there was no turning back. The silence in the classroom grew unbearable. Some students leaned forward on their desks, eager to see what would happen. Others avoided looking directly at her, as though they feared her humiliation might spread like a sickness they could catch if they stared too long. A few whispered, their hushed giggles carrying across the room like little knives. Maya could hear them, even though she tried not to. Her fingers trembled as they hovered above the keys. She remembered the times she had sat at her grandmother's piano at home, her hands confident and steady. There, in the safety of her living room, surrounded by love and encouragement, she had felt invincible. But here, under the scrutiny of her teacher and classmates, she felt stripped of that comfort. Her mind began to race. What if I hit the wrong note? What if my hand shakes so badly that everyone laughs? What if I completely freeze and can't play at all? The questions battered her like waves, each one pulling her deeper into panic. Mr. Harris, standing with his arms crossed near the desk, tilted his head. "Well," he said, his voice carrying a note of impatience. "We're waiting." The sound of his voice cut into her thoughts, snapping her back into the moment. She realized she had to do something. Sitting there in silence would only make things worse. She placed her fingers gently on the cool, smooth keys. The weight of the piano beneath her hands was both familiar and terrifying. It was the same instrument she had always loved, yet it felt foreign now, as if it belonged to another world where she didn't belong. Her classmates held their breath, waiting. Time seemed to stretch. Every second she hesitated felt like an eternity. One boy in the back snickered quietly, muttering to his friend, "She's gonna mess up." The words weren't meant for her ears, but they reached her anyway. Heat rose to her cheeks. She wanted to sink into the floor, but then, somewhere deep inside her, another thought pushed back. It was faint at first, like a whisper. "You know how to do this. You've done this 1,000 times. You are not weak." The voice was her grandmother's, reminding her of every late night spent practicing. Every encouraging smile, every time she had stumbled but gotten back up, her grandmother used to say, "Music isn't about impressing others, Maya. It's about telling your story. When you play, you're not just pressing keys, you're speaking with your soul." That memory flickered through her mind like a candle in the dark. Slowly, her breathing steadied. Her fingers, though still shaking, pressed gently down on the first few keys. A soft, hesitant sound filled the room. It wasn't perfect. The first notes wavered like a nervous voice in front of a crowd. But it was enough to break the silence. Some of the students smirked, already convinced she would fail. But Maya kept going. She played another note, then another, her hands slowly finding their rhythm. It was as if her grandmother's presence wrapped around her, guiding her hands, reminding her that she was not as small as she felt. Mr. Harris raised an eyebrow, the smirk on his face not yet gone, but slightly less confident than before. He leaned against the desk, waiting for the disaster he was sure would come. Maya's heart still pounded, but with every note she pressed, the pounding grew softer, replaced by something else's determination. She thought about all the times people had overlooked her, all the times she had been underestimated, all the times she had stayed quiet when she wanted to speak. She realized this was more than just playing the piano. This was her chance to show them, to show him that she was more than they believed. The room remained silent, except for the hesitant melody filling the air. The whispers had stopped. Even the students who had been waiting for her to fail now leaned forward, curious. Something was happening. Maya felt the weight of pressure on her shoulders, but she also felt the spark of something greater. Her fingers began to move more confidently, tracing patterns on the keys that she had practiced countless times at home. The fear didn't disappear completely, but it shifted, transforming into energy, into power. This was the moment of pressure when the world expected her to collapse, when the teacher expected her to fail, when the classmates expected to laugh. But instead of breaking under it, she felt herself rising. The classroom, once a place of fear, was slowly becoming her stage. Maya's hands rested on the keys. Her breath uneven, but steadier than before. The first hesitant note she had pressed still lingered faintly in the air, like a question waiting for an answer. Her classmates sat frozen, eyes locked on her, as though the entire room had been pulled into a spell of silence. Even the creaking of the old ceiling fan seemed to fade, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The first real melody began softly, almost uncertainly, like a shy voice speaking up in a crowded room. The notes were gentle, fragile, but there was something in them that hinted at depth, hidden strength waiting just beneath the surface. It was the sound of someone opening a door that had been closed for far too long at first. Some of the students exchanged glances. A few smirked, as if convinced that the music would fall apart at any second. But as Maya's fingers moved from one key to the next, something began to shift. The melody grew clearer, smoother, each note blending into the next like water flowing. Over stones, Maya felt her nerves battling with muscle memory. Her hands still trembled slightly, but the years of practice guided her. She remembered late evenings in her grandmother's small living room, the warm smell of tea in the air, the soft encouragement in her grandmother's voice. "Again, Maya. Play it again until your heart feels it." Those words echoed in her mind now, grounding her, steadying her. Her eyes stayed on the keys, but in her mind, she wasn't in the classroom anymore. She was back home, sitting at the old wooden piano that had carried the marks of years of love and use. The chipped ivory keys, the faint scratches on the wood, the quiet hum of her grandmother singing a long knit, all came back to her in vivid detail. Slowly, her fear began to loosen its grip. The melody became less hesitant, more certain. Each note carried with it not just sound, but emotion, her story, her struggle, her hidden strength. What had started as trembling whispers of music began to build into a voice that demanded to be heard. The classmates who had been waiting to laugh now found themselves leaning forward. There was something unexpected in the way she played. Something that didn't match the image they had of the quiet, timid girl they barely noticed each day. It wasn't perfect. There were tiny stumbles, uneven pause, but there was a kind of honesty in it that was impossible to ignore. Mr. Harris's arms, still crossed, furrowed his brow slightly. He had expected clumsy hands, awkward sounds, a moment of embarrassment he could turn into one of his harsh lectures. But what he heard wasn't failure. It wasn't polished brilliance either, but it was real, heartfelt, and far better than he anticipated. The smirk he had worn moments earlier softened into something else, a mix of curiosity and disbelief. Maya didn't notice him. She didn't notice anyone anymore. Her world had narrowed down to her hands and the keys. The pressure that had once felt like a crushing weight began to transform into something different, a fire, a drive. She realized that the very act of being forced to play, of being pushed into this corner, had awakened a side of her she had always kept hidden. She played a simple song at first, one her grandmother had taught her when she was very young. It wasn't flashy or complicated, but it carried warmth and familiarity. The notes floated through the classroom like a soft breeze, brushing past every ear, every heart. It was the kind of music that felt personal, like a secret being shared. As the melody continued, the atmosphere in the room changed. The whispers stopped completely. The students who had smirked now looked at her with widened eyes. Some of them, without even realizing it, began tapping their fingers lightly on their desks. Drawn into the rhythm, Maya's fear had not disappeared, lingered at the edges of her mind, but the music was stronger. For every moment of doubt, there was a memory of her grandmother's encouragement. Every stumble replaced with the determination to keep going. Her heart beat in sync with the music, and with each passing note, she grew bolder. Then something remarkable happened. She shifted from the simple melody into a slightly more complex arrangement. It wasn't planned. Her fingers simply moved where her heart led them. The notes intertwined, rising and falling like waves, carrying with them the emotions she had buried for so long, the pain of being underestimated, the loneliness of being invisible, the quiet strength she had always held inside. For the first time, Maya wasn't just playing for survival. She was playing for herself. She was speaking through the piano in a way she had never dared to speak with her voice. Every sound that came from the instrument was a piece of her, laid bare before the room. The classmates were captivated now. Even the boy who had whispered that she would fail sat stunned, his mouth slightly open. No one laughed. No one dared to interrupt. The room belonged to Maya and the music. Mr. Harris shifted his weight uncomfortably. His arms were still crossed, but his posture wasn't as confident as before. He didn't want to admit it, not even to himself, but there was something extraordinary happening before his eyes. He had intended to make her an example of weakness, yet here she was, turning the very situation into a display of unexpected strength. The first notes that had begun so uncertain had grown into something undeniable. It wasn't just the sound of a student fulfilling an order from her teacher. It was the sound of a girl breaking free, of someone stepping out from the shadows and daring to be seen. By the time Maya lifted her hands briefly from the keys, the classroom felt transformed. The silence that followed wasn't the silence of awkwardness anymore. It was the silence of awe. She had only just begun, but already she had changed the way everyone saw her, and deep inside, Maya felt the truth rising like a flame. This was no longer the teacher's stage, it was hers. The melody that had started as a gentle whisper was no longer timid. It was growing, blossoming into something larger, bolder, unstoppable. Maya's hands, once hesitant and shaky, now glided across the keys with surprising confidence. Her fingers moved in patterns that seemed to come alive on their own, weaving notes together like threads forming a tapestry. The classroom, which had been filled with tension and doubt moments earlier, now vibrated with the sound of music that felt alive, commanding, impossible to ignore. Each chord carried weight, and each progression pulled the students deeper into her world. At first, Maya hadn't planned to play anything complex. She had thought she would stumble through a simple song, just enough to get the ordeal over with. But as she settled into the rhythm, something inside her shifted. The weight of fear that had pressed so heavily on her chest loosened, replaced by a powerful current of energy. It was as though the piano itself had unlocked a door she had kept shut for too long. Her grandmother's lessons came rushing back, not just the notes, but the spirit behind them. She remembered being told, "Music doesn't ask for permission, Maya. It demands to be heard. If you let it, it will carry your soul farther than your voice ever could." Those words echoed in her head now, guiding her too. So instead of stopping after the simple melody, she transitioned seamlessly into a classical piece she had practiced endlessly at home. The shift was sudden, and the students noticed it immediately. Their eyes widened as the notes grew faster, sharper, more intricate. It wasn't the shaky sound of a nervous girl anymore. It was the confident playing of someone who understood not only the piano, but also the emotions it could unleash. The room was completely silent except for the music. Every student was caught off guard. They had expected awkwardness, maybe a few broken notes, maybe laughter at her expense. Instead, they were witnessing a performance that none of them had thought possible. Some of them even leaned forward in their chairs without realizing it, unable to tear their eyes away from her hands flying across the keys. Maya felt the shift inside herself too. It was as if she had stepped out of her old skin. The girl who used to shrink in the classroom, afraid of being noticed, was gone. In her place was someone else, someone bold, someone fierce, someone who could command a room without uttering a single word. Every note she played grew stronger, louder, fuller, until the air itself seemed to hum with her energy. Mr. Harris, still standing at the front of the classroom, felt his jaw tighten. He had expected control her failure, followed by his lesson. Instead, he was losing control. The very tool he had used to belittle her was now becoming her weapon, her stage. His smirk had completely vanished, replaced by a stern expression that couldn't quite hide his shock. He shifted uncomfortably, as if the ground beneath him had tilted. Maya, however, wasn't watching him. She wasn't watching anyone. Her eyes remained closed for a moment, her head slightly bowed, her body swaying gently with the rhythm. She wasn't performing for approval anymore. She was lost in the music, letting it flow through her like a river breaking free from a dam. The melody rose higher, brighter, more commanding. The students could feel it. Some of them even felt goosebumps, as if the sound carried something beyond notes, something alive, something deeply human. The music spoke of struggle, of silence, of hidden strength. It told a story that words could never quite capture. But everyone understood in their hearts. One girl sitting near the back clasped her hands together, her eyes shining. A boy who had been whispering earlier now sat frozen, guilt flashing across his face as he realized how wrong he had been to expect her failure. Each student was caught in the spell Maya was weaving, her music binding them together in awe. And then came the climax. Her fingers moved faster now, her hands crossing over each other, striking chords that thundered through the room. The quiet, fragile sound of the beginning had transformed into something commanding, powerful, unshakable. The piano seemed almost too small to contain the force she poured into it. It was as though Maya herself was changing with each note. She was no longer just the quiet girl in the middle row. She was a force of nature, someone who could hold an entire room in silence, someone whose spirit filled every corner of the space. The rising power of the music wasn't just in the sound, wasn't her not. Mr. Harris's face, usually so stern and controlled, betrayed him. His brows furrowed, his lips pressed tightly together, his eyes darted between her hands and her face. He had thought this would be his moment, but it was becoming hers. He had forced her into the spotlight, and now he couldn't take it away. The room reached a point where even the walls seemed to listen. The music wasn't just filling the space, was commanding it, reshaping it. Maya's classmates didn't dare breathe too loudly, afraid they might break the fragile magic surrounding them. The sound was no longer background noise. It was alive, pulsing, undeniable, and Maya knew it too. She could feel it in her bones, in her blood, in the very tips of her fingers. This was more than just playing a piece of music. This was her voice, her declaration, her rebellion against every moment she had been silenced, doubted, or overlooked. The rising power of her music was her way of telling the world, I am here, I am not invisible, I will be heard by the time. She reached the peak of her performance. Maya was no longer afraid. She wasn't even thinking about the teacher, or her classmates, or the whispers of doubt. She was free, fully immersed in the world she had created with her music. And for the first time in her life, she felt truly unstoppable. Mr. Harris had stood with confidence when Maya first touched the piano keys. In his mind, the scene had already played out. She would fumble, perhaps press a wrong key or two, and the class would chuckle. Then he would step in, deliver one of his usual speeches about discipline, and use her failure as an example of what happens when one is unprepared or timid. But now, as the music filled the classroom, his confidence was crumbling. At first, he had leaned back against his desk with arms crossed, waiting for the disaster. But the disaster never came. Instead, what came was real music, powerful and moving. His smirk had disappeared by the first minute. By the second, his arms had dropped to his sides. By the third, he found himself staring, unable to reconcile what he was hearing with the girl he thought he knew. His jaw tightened. His eyes narrowed, not with anger at Maya, but with disbelief at himself. How had he missed this? How had he, a teacher who prided himself on knowing his students, failed to see the depth of talent sitting in front of him every day? He tried to keep his composure, but his body betrayed him. His breathing grew uneven. His stance shifted uncomfortably, and a bead of sweat trickled slowly down his temple. His carefully built authority, the power he wielded over his students, with fear and intimidation, was being dismantled note by note, key by key. The students had noticed too. Their eyes weren't on him anymore. They were all fixed on Maya, in their young faces. He could see the awe, the admiration, the dawning realization that something remarkable was happening right in front of them. The classroom that had once belonged to him now belonged entirely to her. She held them with her music in a way he never could with his lectures. The sound was undeniable. Her fingers moved with both precision and emotion, combining technique with raw feeling. It wasn't just skill, it was soul. She played with a depth that many seasoned performers struggled to reach. Mr. Harris felt a strange ache in his chest as he listened. Not just from admiration, but from guilt. He had wanted to mock her. He had wanted to strip her of dignity. And instead, she was stripping him of his certainty, his arrogance, his role as the authority in the room. For the first time in years, Mr. Harris didn't know what to say. His mind raced for explanations. Maybe she had been secretly trained. Maybe her family had poured money into lessons he didn't know about. Maybe this was just luck. But deep down, he knew the truth. This was talent. Pure, undeniable talent. And he had nearly crushed it out of her with his cruelty. Maya's eyes were still closed as she played, unaware of the storm raging inside her teacher. She wasn't thinking of him anymore. She was lost in her music, in her freedom. And the more she played, the more the walls around Mr. Harris's pride cracked. He remembered the smirk he had given her when he called her forward, the expectation that she would fail. Now that smirk felt like a shameful scar burning across his face. He could almost feel the weight of his students' eyes, not on Maya, but on him. Could they see it too? Could they see how wrong he had been for a man who thrived on control? The loss of it was unbearable. Yet, in the same breath, he could not deny the awe stirring inside him. He had spent years teaching students scales, exercises, and theory. Yet here was Maya, teaching him something far greater: the power of hidden potential, the danger of underestimation, the beauty of raw passion. The notes rose higher, fiercer, and Mr. Harris's throat tightened. He felt exposed, as though her music was peeling away the layers of his pride and showing the truth underneath. He had underestimated her, yes, but worse. He had underestimated the very thing he claimed to teach: the power of music to transform, to reveal, to humble. The students had forgotten he even existed. They were too enraptured by Maya's performance. Their eyes wide, their mouths slightly open. They didn't giggle. They didn't whisper. They didn't move. In that silence, broken only by the storm of sound, Maya unleashed. Mr. Harris realized something he had never wanted to admit. He was no longer in control of this classroom. She was Dot, and for the first time in his career, he felt a small dot each. Notes seemed to press harder against him, not physically, but emotionally, as though the piano itself was pointing a finger at him, accusing him of cruelty, of blindness. He shifted his stance again, clearing his throat, but no sound came out. What could he say? To interrupt her would be to expose his own insecurity. To let her continue was to let the world see his failure. Yet, deep in his heart, another feeling stirred, something he hadn't felt in years: respect. Not the kind of respect he demanded from his students through fear, but the kind of respect that grows naturally when faced with undeniable greatness. The music reached its peak, loud and commanding, and he found himself clenching his fists, not in anger, but in helplessness. He was no longer the teacher in this moment. He was the student, and Maya was the one teaching him. By the time the melody began to soften again, Mr. Harris knew the truth he could never say aloud. He had tried to humiliate her, but instead, she had humiliated him. And she had done it not with cruelty or words, but with grace, courage, and talent. For the first time in his long career, Mr. Harris stood speechless. When the final notes of Maya's rising crescendo began to ripple through the air. Something strange happened in the classroom. For a brief moment, the world felt suspended, as if time itself had paused to listen. Every student sat frozen, their eyes fixed on the quiet girl who had just shattered all their expectations. No one laughed, no one whispered. The silence that filled the room wasn't heavy like before. It was electric, alive, pulsing with awe. It took a few seconds for the students to even process what had just happened. They had all walked into class that day thinking Maya was just the shy girl who barely spoke, the girl who blended into the background like wallpaper. Some of them had even smirked when Mr. Harris called her forward, already tasting the embarrassment they were sure would follow. But now, those same students sat stunned, their smug expressions wiped clean, their jaws hanging slightly open. The first sound to break the silence was a soft gasp. It came from a girl in the front row, her eyes wide as though she couldn't believe what she had just heard. Then, another student muttered, "Whoa," under his breath, his voice filled with disbelief. And then, as Maya lifted her fingers gently from the keys, letting the last note echo into stillness, The reaction? Erupted. Hands began to clap. First, it was just one or two hesitant, uncertain, as though the students weren't sure if applause was even allowed. But then the sound spread, growing louder, stronger, until the entire classroom thundered with applause. Desks rattled as students leaned forward, clapping with genuine excitement. Some even stood without realizing it, pulled up by the energy of the moment. Maya blinked, startled. She hadn't expected this. She had braced herself for laughter, for ridicule maybe, even cruel jokes whispered behind her back later. But what she received instead was admiration. For the first time, her classmates weren't looking at her with pity or indifference. They were looking at her with respect. "Did you see her hands?" One boy whispered loudly to his friend. "She's amazing." Another girl breathed, still clapping. "I didn't know she could do that." Someone exclaimed. The room buzzed with awe. The same classmates who had ignored her for so long now treated her like someone extraordinary, someone who had just performed a miracle before their eyes. Maya felt her face warm, her cheeks flushing with a mix of shock and shyness. She wanted to hide, but at the same time, she couldn't deny the flicker of pride that glowed inside her chest. She had been forced into this moment, pushed into the spotlight against her will, but instead of breaking under the pressure, she had risen, and now she stood taller because of it. Somewhere in the crowd of clapping hands, Maya noticed something else. There were no cruel smiles. There was no mocking. The same students who had once dismissed her were now nodding with approval, even admiration. Their eyes no longer saw her as the quiet, invisible girl. They saw her as someone who had power, someone who had a voice louder than words. The applause grew louder, echoing off the walls. A boy in the back let out a sharp whistle, and others joined in, cheering. For a classroom that had once been thick with tension and silence, it now felt like a concert hall roaring with appreciation. Even the students who had doubted her most were caught up in it. The boy who had whispered earlier that she would mess up clapped harder than anyone, trying to hide his embarrassment at being so wrong. A girl who had never spoken to Maya before leaned forward, eyes sparkling, as if silently saying, "I want to know you now." For Maya, it was overwhelming. She had never been the center of attention like this, not in a good way. She had always been the one who slipped by unnoticed, who blended into the crowd. But now, every pair of eyes was on her, and, for once, it felt good. It felt right. The energy of the classroom had shifted completely. It no longer belonged to Mr. Harris with his authority and his sharp tongue. It no longer belonged to the fear that once lingered in the air. It belonged to Maya. She had turned humiliation into triumph, silence into applause, invisibility into recognition. And as she sat there, still catching her breath from the intensity of the music, she realized something she had never felt before. She mattered. Her gift, her passion, her voice, all mattered. And her classmates knew it too. Mr. Harris, standing at the front of the room, remained motionless. His face was unreadable, but his silence only amplified the students' reaction. They weren't clapping for him. They weren't clapping out of obedience or fear. They were clapping because they had been moved, and that truth burned brighter than anything else in the room. The applause went on and on, a storm of sound that seemed endless. Maya's hands, resting quietly on her lap now, still tingled with the memory of the keys. She wasn't sure how to react, whether to bow, whether to smile, whether to hide her face. She chose simply to sit there, her lips curving into the smallest of shy smiles, a smile that spoke volumes. And in that moment, Maya's classmates understood something they never had before. Greatness can come from the most unexpected places. Sometimes the quietest person in the room carries the loudest song. Asterisk, when the clapping finally faded, the classroom didn't feel like the same place anymore. Something had shifted. something deep and unspoken, as though an invisible line had been crossed. The walls once filled with the heavy silence of fear and judgment now seemed to carry the echo of Maya's music. That sound would linger in the memory of everyone who had been there long after the day was over. Maya remained seated at the piano, her hands resting lightly on her lap, her heart still beating fast from the performance. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, and the roar of applause still rang in her ears. A small part of her wanted to hide, to retreat back into the shadows where she had always lived. But another part, the stronger part, knew there was no going back. She had been seen, truly seen, and she would never be invisible again. Her classmates looked at her differently now. They weren't looking past her, as if she were just another quiet student in the middle row. They were looking at her as if she had revealed a hidden light, a brilliance that had been waiting all along. A girl who had once blended into the background had now carved her name into their memory. For the rest of the class, the atmosphere was different. Conversations buzzed in hushed, excited tones. Students exchanged glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others whispering about how amazing she was. Even the ones who had once dismissed her or ignored her now felt a quiet respect blooming inside. But the biggest change wasn't in the students, it was in Mr. Harris. He still stood at the front of the classroom, silent. His face was pale, his posture stiff, his authority shattered. The man who had prided himself on control, who had believed humiliation was a tool for growth, now found himself humbled by the very student he had tried to belittle. He had underestimated her. Worse, he had tried to destroy her dignity. And yet, she had risen above it, not with anger, not with rebellion, but with grace, with music. With talent so pure that it demanded silence, respect, and awe. Inside, Mr. Harris wrestled with emotions he didn't know how to name. Shame burned the back of his throat, regret twisted in his stomach. But also, buried within it all, was admiration, raw and undeniable. Maya had done what he had never expected. She had turned his attempt at cruelty into a triumph so powerful that even he, the teacher, had been left speechless. When the bell rang at last, it startled everyone. The sharp sound pulled the students back into reality, but the spell of the performance still hung in the air. Books closed, chairs scraped against the floor, but the buzz of energy didn't fade. They whispered Maya's name as they packed their bags, stealing glances at her as if she were a new person altogether. Maya stood slowly, gathering her things. She felt shaky, but not from fear, any more from the overwhelming realization of what had just happened. She had faced the worst of her fears, humiliation, in front of her classmates, and had turned it into victory. She had proven, not just to them but to herself, that her voice mattered. Even if it came through piano keys instead of words. As she walked past her classmates, some of them smiled at her. Others nodded, a gesture of quiet respect. A girl who had never spoken to her before whispered, "That was incredible," as Maya passed. The words sent a warmth through her chest. When she reached the door, she glanced back once. Mr. Harris was still at his desk, staring at the piano as if it had betrayed him. For the first time, he didn't look like the man in charge. He looked small, humbled, lost in thought. Their eyes met for the briefest moment. He didn't speak, but Maya didn't need him to. She could see it in his face. He had learned his lesson. From that day on, things were never quite the same. Maya wasn't suddenly the most popular girl in school. She didn't want to be, but she was no longer invisible. Students who had once overlooked her now acknowledged her. Teachers who had barely noticed her name on the roster began to recognize her potential. And deep inside herself, Maya carried something far more important: the knowledge that her gift was real, and that it had power. At home, when she told her grandmother what had happened, the older woman simply smiled, her eyes shining with pride. "I told you, Maya," she said softly. "Music tells the truth that words cannot. You showed them who you are without saying a word." Maya realized her grandmother was right. She hadn't needed to shout or fight to be heard. She had spoken through the piano, and in doing so, she had found her voice. As for Mr. Harris, the story of that day spread quickly among the students, and though he never openly admitted his mistake, something in him changed too. He stopped using humiliation as a weapon. He grew quieter, more thoughtful, as if Maya's music had struck not just the piano keys, but the keys of his own conscience. And in that classroom, whenever a student glanced at the piano, they no longer saw it as just an instrument gathering dust in the corner. They saw it as the place where a quiet girl named Maya once played, and with her music turned silence into thunder, fear into strength, and doubt into respect. It was more than just a performance. It was a moment that rewrote her story. A moment that left everyone who witnessed it forever changed. Because sometimes the greatest lessons don't come from the teacher. They come from the student who dares to show the world the power they've kept hidden all along.